I never expected my retirement party to become the moment my entire life collapsed in front of everyone I knew. My name is Robert Hale, and I am 70 years old. I worked for over 45 years as an operations manager at a logistics company, starting from the lowest position and slowly building my way up through discipline and consistency. My life was never glamorous, but it was stable. I believed that stability would be respected by the people closest to me, especially my family. I was wrong. The party was organized by my son Jason and my daughter Melissa. They insisted it would be a celebration of my career and sacrifice. I trusted them completely. They chose a large banquet hall, invited relatives, old colleagues, and neighbors, and presented it as a special evening dedicated to honoring my retirement. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to feel appreciated. I arrived early, wearing my best suit, believing I was about to experience a rare moment of gratitude for my own family. At first, everything appeared normal. People greeted me, shared memories, and congratulated me on my retirement. I even saw a few former co-workers I had not met in years. But I noticed something unusual as the evening progressed. Jason and Melissa were unusually focused on controlling the event rather than participating in it. They handled microphones, coordinated announcements, and frequently exchanged looks that did not feel celebratory. It created a quiet discomfort that I could not yet understand. The moment the public humiliation began, it happened without warning. Jason took the stage first and started speaking about my career, but his tone was different from what I expected. Instead of respect, his words carried sarcasm. He began highlighting my old-fashioned methods at work and described me as someone who refused to adapt to modern systems. Few people in the audience laughed nervously, unsure if it was meant to be a joke or criticism. I stood frozen, trying to process what was happening. Then Melissa joined him on stage, and the situation worsened. She spoke about family finances and began suggesting that I had been too controlling with money throughout my life. The conversation shifted away from my career achievements and toward accusations disguised as humor. What was supposed to be a celebration slowly transformed into a public critique of my entire life. I realized then that the event was not designed to honor me. It was designed to redefine how others saw me. By the time the speeches ended, I understood the full intention. My family had not brought people together to celebrate my retirement. They had used the gathering to embarrass me in front of colleagues, friends, and relatives. I stood there surrounded by applause that no longer felt genuine, realizing that the respect I thought I had earned over decades could be rewritten in a single evening by the people I trusted most. But what they did not know was that I had already discovered something they had been hiding from me for months. Part 2. After the speeches ended, the atmosphere in the hall no longer felt like a celebration. It felt staged, controlled, and carefully directed toward a message I was never told in advance. I remained seated, observing how people around me reacted. Some looked uncomfortable, others avoided eye contact, and a few followed Jason and Melissa's lead as if they were expected to participate in the narrative being built about me. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. My identity in that room was being rewritten in real time. When the formal program ended, people began mingling again, but I noticed something more concerning. Small groups were discussing what had been said on stage. The remarks made by my children were spreading through conversations, shaping how others perceived my entire career. Years of professional reputation were being compressed into selective criticisms, delivered in a single evening. I understood then that the intention was not emotional expression. It was reputational control. I left the main hall briefly and stepped outside into the cold air. That was when I received the first clear sign that something larger was happening behind my back. A former colleague, David Mercer, approached me privately. He had worked with me for nearly 20 years and still maintained strong connections inside the company. He looked uneasy and carefully chose his words before telling me that discussions about my retirement transition had started long before the party. According to him, Jason had been meeting with certain individuals from the company's internal management circle. These meetings were not casual. They involved restructuring plans, connected to my retirement benefits and authority transition. My name had been included in discussions about phasing out outdated leadership influence, a phrase I had never heard used about me directly until that moment. It became clear that the public humiliation at the party was not isolated. It was part of a broader attempt to reshape my professional legacy while I was still alive. When I returned inside, I noticed Jason speaking privately with a few senior attendees near the bar area. Their body language suggested familiarity rather than casual conversation. Melissa was nearby, monitoring reactions from guests and occasionally adjusting how certain conversations were guided. It was no longer difficult to see the coordination the event had structure beyond a family gathering. It functioned as a controlled narrative presentation. The realization settled slowly but firmly. My retirement party had been used as a platform to weaken my authority and influence in front of people who once respected me professionally. By undermining my image publicly, they were indirectly shaping how decisions about my retirement, benefits, and final role would be perceived by others connected to the company. What made it worse was understanding the timing. The party had been planned precisely at the moment when internal transitions were being finalized. My children were not just embarrassed me emotionally. They were aligning themselves with a shift that positioned me as irrelevant in both family and professional contexts. But the most disturbing part was yet to come. David quietly handed me a printed document before leaving. It contained references to a planned restructuring proposal that listed my retirement phase as accelerated due to reduced leadership value contribution. My signature was required on a document I had never seen before. At that moment, I understood the direction of everything. The humiliation was not the end of the event. It was the beginning of something planned long before I arrived. After leaving the hall briefly, I no longer saw the event as a family celebration. It had become a coordinated effort involving more than just my children. The document David Mercer gave me was enough to confirm that discussions about my retirement had been shaped without my awareness. My name had been used in internal proposals that framed me as an obstacle to modern restructuring. That language did not appear accidentally. It reflected a deliberate attempt to remove my influence while keeping the process technically compliant. When I returned inside, Jason and Melissa were still maintaining control over conversations. Guests were no longer openly laughing, but the damage had already spread. People who once spoke to me with respect now treated me with cautious distance, as if I were already disconnected from the role I had spent decades building. The perception shift was immediate and measurable. Reputation does not collapse through one event alone. It collapses when narratives are reinforced by repetition in the same environment. Later that evening, I overheard a conversation between Jason and one of the company's regional managers. The discussion was brief but revealing. Jason was presenting my retirement as a necessary step for organizational progress, emphasizing that leadership change required removal of outdated operational thinking. The manager did not directly disagree, which indicated that the narrative was already being accepted at higher levels. I realized then that the humiliation was not only personal, it was strategically aligned with corporate positioning. Melissa's role became clearer as well. She was managing social perception, ensuring that guests associate my retirement with inefficiency rather than achievement. Every interaction she facilitated subtly reinforced the same idea, that my era of contribution was over. The psychological effect was consistent and controlled. I was being reclassified in real time from contributor to liability. I stepped outside again to regain clarity. The air was colder, but it helped stabilize my thoughts. I reviewed the document again and noticed references to accelerated transition protocol and legacy deactivation timeline. These were not emotional terms. They were procedural. Someone inside the organization had converted my retirement into a managed removal process, and my family had become part of that structure. whether knowingly or not. At that point, I stopped focusing on the humiliation itself and started focusing on the origin of the decision. Jason did not have the authority to initiate such a restructuring alone. That meant someone above him had approved or guided the process. The question shifted from why is this happening to who benefits from it being framed this way. When I returned to Hall, I no longer reacted emotionally. I observed. Patterns became clearer. Certain executives were avoiding me entirely, while others treated Jason as an emerging point of contact. That shift in attention was intentional. It indicated that authority. Transfer was already being normalized socially before being finalized officially. By the end of the night, the structure behind the event was no longer hidden. My retirement party had functioned as a soft launch of my replacement narrative. My family's public humiliation was not an isolated act of disrespect. It was integrated into a broader transition strategy that I had not been consulted on. The final realization was simple. I was not being celebrated. I was being replaced. After the retirement party ended, I did not go home with my children. I left alone. The humiliation in the hall no longer mattered as much as what it revealed. The real issue was not emotional disrespect. It was structural displacement. Someone had already started reshaping my position inside the company, and my family had been used as the public-facing layer of that process. The next morning, I went directly to meet Harold Stanton, the company's longtime legal advisor. I did not explain everything immediately. I only showed him the document David Mercer had given me and the restructuring references I had collected. His reaction was immediate and controlled. He confirmed that the terminology used in the papers aligned with internal transition protocols, but he also pointed out a critical issue. No official retirement restructuring of my level could proceed without my formal consent and documented review. That single fact changed the entire situation. Harold initiated a full internal audit request. Within days, the corporate structure behind the accelerated transition began to surface. It was not a formal retirement process initiated by HR. It was an informal strategy developed through middle management channels, justified using selective performance interpretation and reputational framing. In simple terms, my authority had been targeted without proper authorization, and my public image was being shaped to make the transition appear voluntary. Jason's involvement became clearer during the investigation. Emails and meeting logs showed that he had participated in discussions with certain managers about reducing legacy, dependency, and operational decision-making. While he did not have final authority, his role had been to reinforce a perception that I was already stepping down mentally and professionally. Melissa's actions at the party aligned with the same objective, social confirmation of a narrative that was never formally approved by me. Once the internal audit gained momentum, the situation shifted quickly. Senior leadership became aware that procedural boundaries had been crossed. The restructuring proposal was frozen immediately. All references to my accelerated transition were suspended pending formal review. What had started as a social humiliation was now under corporate investigation. When Jason learned about the audit, his behavior changed. The confidence he displayed at the party disappeared. He attempted to justify his involvement by framing it as forward planning and supporting organizational efficiency, but the documentation did not support his interpretation. Melissa stopped contacting me entirely, avoiding any direct conversation about the events of that night. I did not respond to either of them immediately. The situation was no longer emotional. It was procedural. The system that had been used to redefine me was now reversing direction under formal scrutiny. A week later, I was called into a board-level review meeting. The findings were clear. No legitimate authorization existed for the restructuring attempt, and the narrative presented at the retirement party had been constructed without approval from governance channels. The decision was reversed entirely. My position was formally reinstated as fully respected within the company's legacy structure, even though I had already chosen to retire. After the meeting, I understood something that went beyond the company itself. The humiliation at the party was not a conclusion. It was an exposure point. My family had assumed perception could override structure. It could not, once documentation and authority, alignment were reviewed. The narrative collapsed under its own inconsistency. In the end, I did not seek revenge. I did not need to. The system corrected itself. And those who tried to redefine my life learned a simple truth. Public perception can be manipulated for a moment, but structure always wins in the end.